Hi, my name is Joseph P. Reedy, R-E-E-D-Y.
Okay, and what positions did you hold in CSEA, and what was your work history here?
I came to work in February of 1968. I was hired as a collective bargaining specialist. Uh, Towards the end of my 18th year, I became the executive assistant to, at that time, President Bill McGowan. Uh, because of the politics involved at that time, when McGowan retired, I also left. And I came back 6 years later as the regional director for the capital region here in Albany. And I performed those duties for 10 years.
Okay. Let me ask you this. When did you first become aware of an organization called CSEA?
Actually, about a year before that, I was the president of an independent union in a meatpacking plant here in Albany. And a friend of mine ran into a guy named Joe Dolan, who was working for CSEA, and he inquired about my whereabouts. And he was advised by my friend that I was in the labor movement, I was unhappy, and I was looking to do something to turn my life around. He then indicated that there had recently or was going to be a law passed called the Taylor Law, and I should contact him. So somewhere around 67.
Okay, but you didn't have any real awareness of CSEA otherwise as to what they were, what they did?
No, sir.
What have you. So when you got here, what was the scene like in 1968?
Uh, Confused might be the wrong word, but these people were very apprehensive. There wasn't anyone here, with a couple exceptions, a gentleman named Manny Vitale, the only one I can think of that had any real labor experience when it came to negotiating and administering contracts. The field staff was primarily responsible for making sure the civil service law was followed and things of that nature, but no contract and no enforcement. So they were very apprehensive.
What kind of staff was there at that time? I mean, was it a large staff, small staff?
You know, at the time you might say, I'd say small. I don't exactly know what the numbers were, but we did have, they weren't called regional directors, but field staff, and they had field staff supervisors, and they were spread throughout the state. We had the research department. We had some attorneys assigned here. And I don't know, I'd have to think a while, but that's pretty much it, you know. We had attorneys, we had a resource department, and the field services.
And why were they apprehensive? Because of the Taylor Law coming into enactment and the need to respond in a different way than they had previously covered their membership?
And from my perspective, they were going to have to negotiate contracts. They're going to have to represent people. And in most cases, they didn't even know how to get to the bargaining table to talk down and put together contract proposals. That became my primary responsibility. I was responsible in a large capacity to developing contract language for the field staff that were trying to put together language out in the field. And they would call me and ask me, you know, to put together contract language as they went through the process. So they were very apprehensive. They also had to organize. We did have an organizing department because we had, I think, one or two organizers. The one organizer I was familiar with was Jack Pender. So they had to organize too. And it was a whole different perspective. We were competing with other unions. There was dues involved. And we were looked at as a social organization, while labor out there was looked at as the big tough guy. So they were apprehensive. It was just a whole new ballgame for them. They hadn't been there. And quite frankly, I hadn't been involved but in a little bit of organizing myself. I was attacked by the Amalgamated Meat Cutters in my final years as the president of the Independent Packers, but that was limited my experience. But I did have probably the most experience anybody had here in negotiating and putting together contract language.
When you say CSEA was largely looked at as a social organization, was that the way it was looked down upon by AFL-CIO unions, or was that the way the organization perceived itself at that time?
I say a combination of both. You know, we had our conventions, we had our insurance, supplemental insurance, and we didn't have to do anything other than, you know, the little mundane things. But yeah, I mean, it was our feeling, and I say probably from the top down, that we were looked down by even the Commissioner of Labor. They allowed people to go on leave without pay to organize. John Kramer and Bob Payne, who worked for the Department of Labor, were out there organizing wherever I went. And it didn't matter what the challenge was, they were out there. So there's a lot of contempt for probably what we had, because we had a lot of people tied up in this health insurance, not health insurance, but supplemental disability or whatever, sick insurance.
Well, I mean, obviously CSEA had a very extensive network, had a lot of members signed up. Was that primarily because of the insurance program?
Yes.
Or other things that they did?
No, it was the insurance program. Probably, I mean, I'm guessing at this point in time, because I wasn't out in the field. Actually, I never really served as a field rep. We did have to make sure that the civil service law was followed. So they did things in that area, like the 1 out of 3 and people's qualifications in that, and they were constantly dealing with the Civil Service Commission. So we had that type of a rapport with the membership. We were the only show in town, so to speak, at that time. So we had the numbers, and they had, yeah, they were jealous of what we had going into this election.
You know, as I read back about some of the history, it looks like the association did do some, or make some strides in terms of terms and conditions of employment through legislation.
Yes.
At least on the state side.
Yes.
I mean, is that what they also did on the local government side, or would they enact through state legislation the coverage for the local government, do you know?
Where it applied, like they would make the retirement available and the various degrees of retirement that you could participate in available. So that anything that was covered under civil service law, if it had application with local government, they would be at times included. But we were, without a doubt, and probably right up until, well, I don't say 10 years, maybe longer, we were always considered a state union and a state dominated in numbers. You know, we always had the state side always had the numbers. So the board of directors was controlled by state members, and so therefore that's where the balance went. So that was the reputation and the ID we had out there. Local government didn't really have, because they were so diversified and there were so many of them, they didn't fit into the picture quite as cleanly as the state did.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the state, because when you came on staff, the Taylor Law was recently enacted. Was CSEA recognized at that time as the bargaining unit for the majority of state employees?
Not to my knowledge. There was elections called for to determine who was going to represent the workers. There was a commitment supposedly made by Governor Rockefeller at the time that there would be one unit, and that's what we were pushing for. Joe Lochner, our executive director, and DeGraff Foy, our counsel, thought they had a deal with Rockefeller that we were going to have one unit. And we knew that if we had one bargaining unit based on our membership or our association, we could win. But that didn't happen. And they agreed that there would be 6 or 7 bargaining units. I'm not sure exactly, but there was the administrative, the institutional, the operational, I don't know if I said the administrative, and the professional, scientific, and technical, and then there was the state police, and there was a security unit. and maybe a couple other followed later on. I know that um, Office of Court Administration and Division of Military and Naval Affairs came on later. So there was some more fragmentation down the road. But so we felt as if that, we had been double-crossed by the governor at that time. And we as an organization were very resistant to the change. And we had some real problems about the Public Employee Relations Board because we felt it was a wing of the governor. He appointed the staff, and so they would be controlled by him. So we didn't feel as if we could get a fair shake out of that group either.
This was all uncharted water at this time.
Right, right. The best resource we had was over in Massachusetts. They had a similar law, and it's ironic that I can remember this, but a guy named McCluskey did a workshop for us up in Brubaker Hall in SUNY, and he was good, and he told us about the law and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that he said that if you can't accept this in the labor movement, you should probably get out. And he said that there's nothing more constant than change. And I'll never forget that. And there's a lot of things. And that's some of our frustrations as we go through this is the change. And for you, as you know, the change can be by the hour, by the half hour, by the minute. So it was true. And I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but you'll see that as the Taylor law is implemented. There's constant changes,
So they've established then basically six bargaining units. What kind of procedure was set up for who was going to represent those bargaining units, and how did that proceed?
First of all, there had to be a showing of interest, which meant you had to have designation cards. I wasn't involved in that because at that point in time I was, involved in my local government responsibility. This was being done by a law firm and some people in Joe Lochner's office. I came on the scene when I got assigned to the operational unit, and that was when I really officially took over my responsibilities on the state side. But there was a showing of interest, and then there was a mail ballot, and the balloting and the count of the ballots was done at the Washington Avenue Armory. We had an entourage of staff and employees from each one of those bargaining units assigned to count the ballots or to be observers in the count of the ballots, and each day was scheduled for a different unit to be counted. Interesting too, we knew that we were weak in downstate because that's where the strong labor force was. So we devised, whoever we are, but we devised a concept that we would challenge certain ballots that had downstate zip codes on them. And we would figure out a challenge, whatever it might be. But then ballots would then be put aside, and they would be only counted if they came into play. So we came, to the table with some ideas of how to play dirty pool. I'm sure our friends did too. But we were successful in 4 of the units. We didn't win the security, we didn't win the state police, but we did win the PS&T, the administrative, the operational, and the institutional. And I have to tell you, there were some scenes up there in the armory that got out of hand. There was some punches thrown, and there was some stuff that happened at the various tables. It was, there was 50,000, 40,000, 30,000 ballots being counted on one day, and they were spread over 50 or 60 tables with observers at each table, looking at the envelope, looking at the postmark, then opening them and all of that. So it was hectic. It was an experience. So it was not a cakewalk.
This was right here at the Washington Avenue
Right.
Armory?
Yeah. Joel Dolan ran it for CSEA. Harvey Marlowe was there from PERB, and they had certain staff that were running the election. But yeah, it was a week long.
Was there an actual campaign that led up to this? What happened out in the field?
Yeah, there was a campaign. and certain people that had come on staff had certain responsibilities. People were hired from those units to go out there and campaign. Nothing as sophisticated as you might see or as complicated as you might see as today, because it was really happening fast. And we had the numbers. So once again, I wasn't out there, you know, to do a lot of that campaigning. But we had rallies and we had meetings and we did presentations and we talked a little law and we talked about their rights and things of that nature. A lot of concentration was done on the thruway area and work locations 5 miles off the thruway and the major institutional units, because that's where you had the big concentration, whether it be the administrative, the operational, or the institutional workers. So we focused on those places, and we had a jump start on the other unions, no doubt about it.
Who was CSEA's major competition in that representation election?
You know, it was the AFL-CIO. There was a guy named John Kramer and Bob Payne, who were put on leave from the Department of Labor. They're the two names I'm familiar with. There was SEIU was out there all the time, and they were tough. Champa was a guy you might heard about. I can't think of his first name, but he was with SEIU. He marched with Martin Luther King. He became a national figure. He was out there, and they were nasty.
What about AFSCME?
And AFSCME was out there. I don't know how much AFSCME was out there in the get-go. I'm not sure. I don't know when AFSCME became AFSCME. You know, if they would consider the AFL-CIO. Talking about 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. You'd have to go back to see when when that group was even created. But I have to tell you, when
I thought it was Jerry Werf's brother who was heading up the AFSCME council that they had put together.
You're right. Yeah, it could have been. It could have been Jerry and Al Werf. That's right. You're absolutely right. I didn't know they were called AFSCME though. Now that you can remind me, yeah, because they were out in the thruway against me too. So it was Werf and his brother Al, and they were affiliated with the AFL-CIO. But the AFL-CIO stood alone. So AFSCME was there, and Kramer and Payne were back and forth, and Champa was there with SEIU, and the Teamsters were out there to some degree. There was about 4 or 5 unions, because I know when I did the thruway elections, I had at least 4 unions on my tail. So, yeah, it probably was AFSCME that broke our back with the PS&T. I know that. Okay. You know, so.
After CSEA gets recognized, what happened in terms of the state units and negotiating a contract with New York?
Okay, we won the operational unit, which was the blue-collar workers. We institutional unit, which was the people that worked in the ward series in the mental institution, and the PS&T unit, which were the professional, and then the administrative, which were kind of the clerical type people. I was assigned to the operational unit, which was the blue-collar. Bob Guile was assigned to the institutional unit. He had come out of one of the Marcy State Hospital. He was a local president there. And then there was Bernie Ryan, came from, I don't know where. He was hired as a CBS, but he was assigned to the PS&T unit. And John Conaby, who had been on staff as a field rep, was assigned to the administrative unit. And teams were brought in, negotiations were prepared, and it was determined that there would be coalition negotiations on those issues that impacted on all 4 bargaining units. And then the bargaining units themselves would do independent unit negotiations. But the big negotiations were the salaries, the health insurance, and things of that nature.
What was that whole process like? Because, I mean, you were saying this was sort of a new territory for CSEA. You had some experience in negotiating and were putting together the framework, but you also had these teams of rank-and-file members or activist members coming together. So what was that first experience like?
it was a great experience. It was also very frustrating because the employer a lot of times would hide behind the civil service law, and they would say things aren't negotiable because of the civil service law. There's some other law covering that. But it was I guess it was a great highlight of my life, my experience. With a great deal of humility, I would have to say a lot of people came to me because they thought I knew more than I did know, because I had that identity. But I certainly didn't know as much as some of them thought I knew. But they relied on me because of my experience, and I had been at the table for 3 contracts at least, 2 as a president and 1 as a vice president. So, and everybody was very apprehensive. But they got comfortable, and, there was a lot of end fighting. As a matter of fact, I'll digress for a minute, but I represented the Department of Transportation, and my chairperson of the Department of Transportation was a guy named Dick Cleary out of Syracuse. He was an engineer. And there was so much disparity between the blue-collar workers, the labor, and the professionals and benefits. I mean, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have job protection. The labor didn't have a job protection. My gang had nothing really to speak of. They were political hacks. They got appointed when there was a change in politics, and they served at the pleasure of whatever party got them there. The professional had job security because they had taken tests and got there. There was a lot of discussion about whether there'd be a flat dollar raise or a percentage raise. And our professional people were arguing that it had to be a percentage raise. When the agreement was reached, there was a flat dollar amount. For the operational services unit, I think our total package figure was like 40%. For the institutional unit, the total package was like 15%. Now, don't hold me to these, but we got some real big numbers. And I think that's what started the fragment and caused the stress between the PS&T unit and the other 3 bargaining units, and probably ultimately why we lost them, because we always got this flat dollar. It was a catch-up process for the lower 3 units that we represented. Dick Cleary, after that contract, never spoke to me again. He never, like I had something to do with it, but he never forgave me or CSEA for selling him out and getting this flat dollar amount through. So that was one of the interesting highlights of my life, and one of the things that CSEA as an organization had to deal with, because percentages for people that were making $15,000 and $12,000, 10% was what, $1,200. So if you're up there at whatever they were at, 27,000, and I'm picking numbers out of the sky, it was a lot different. And our board had a lot of PS&T people on it at the time, and they were the vocal people. So it was a real nightmare for CSEA to try to balance that and to continue to maintain those lower workers. And the choice we made was to bump them up and bring them up to the other group, which ultimately, I think that, surprisingly enough, that operational unit has caught up in some respects to the private sector, which I never thought I'd live to see. And the ironic part about it is PS&T never got any further. They always stayed where they were. They never made any great inroads because they were professionals. They always took our settlement, whatever that was, and had to live by it because that was the way it was.
So after the first contract was put into place, you talked about when we were chatting before about the fact that they then went back into departmental negotiations, and how did that work?
What happened was, because we didn't know what was out there throughout the state, both CSEA and the state, it was decided that we couldn't resolve these issues at that particular price, that time and place, that we would have departmental negotiations. And we set up ground rules and dates and time frames to commence departmental negotiations. And the purpose of that was to bring these things into focus and find out what was out there and agree on what we could agree on. The significant one were like time off for social leave, the conventions. And there was 2 conventions at that time off. Time off for social events such as a clam bake or something that was unique to the department, whether it be tax, motor vehicle, what. They all had their clam bakes and they all had their Christmas parties, and they'd get 2 or 4 hours off, depending on how powerful the president was at that particular time. And some of them had office space. And there was a lot of other unique things like time off and things of that nature. And so we all decided we would bring this all into departmental negotiations. And we had them. I'd have to say that it became a nightmare because, some of the departments were willing to do it and some of the departments were very apprehensive. And some of the departments were able to hang on to things. But it was very frustrating. It was actually more frustrating at a time than it was the statewide negotiations because it was difficult to bring things to a wrap up, in particular in the smaller departments. But to the best of our ability, we got the job done.
Now, did those departmental negotiations lead to what was called the Easter Sunday strike?
Yes. And what happened was these departmental negotiations, in some instances, were put in writing, and what happened was the state became aware. They, state here in Albany, became aware of there were things going on out there that they didn't sanction. So they came to the table with what we called takeaways. And it was the attitude of CSEA at that time that we had only had one contract. And we were quite fortunate to reach an agreement, and we were not going to give up any of those benefits we had, whether they be prior to the Taylor Law or since the Taylor Law.
When you say they became aware of things that were going on, basically like side agreements or local agreements?
Right. The little agreements that were happening down in the city or happening out west or even here in Albany, where the commissioners had a lot of authority, and it was never questioned. I mean, SUNY, they were little, what would you say, not fiefdoms, but little, I don't know.
Very independent.
Yeah, very independent, along with tax and motor vehicle and DOT. Those commissioners had a lot of authority, so they had a lot of sidebar agreements. And the governor's office wasn't aware of it. So they came to the table with takeaways, and we as a group agreed that we weren't going to negotiate takeaways. So on Good Friday, probably I could say 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the institutional people walked out of negotiations, and then the other 3 units followed. And that was the beginning of the Easter weekend strike.
So it was kind of the institutions that were driving it, and what actually happened.
Well, it wasn't the institution, it was a bigger group. They were probably a more vocal group at the time. But we had agreed privately that, we weren't going to give up, and so it was a done deal, it happened. And, we were then, the Attorney General's office came over and tried to serve notice on Wenzel and put some notices on the door, and we took Wenzel out of the building, and the other officers, Tom McDonough at the time, and hid him out in the Governor's Inn out in Western Avenue, and then we came back, and we were in the DeWitt Clinton, which is across the street from the Capitol, and negotiations were being done between the law firm, and ultimately Monday everybody went back to work. That was another thing that caused some internal strife, though, because depending on the local and the unit, some people really went out on strike and had to pay the 2-for-1 penalty, and others didn't, and they didn't have to pay any penalties. So there was a lot of scab, no scab, gutless stuff going on within the organization itself that we had to, rise above. But it was a problem for us.
You say it was basically resolved by Monday. I mean, did CSEA come out on top in that circumstance?
That's a hard one to determine. We went back to the table. I don't quite remember exactly what the agreement was. But back in those days, we had good agreements. There was a long way to come. And so I would say at that point in time, I was happy. Probably the operational unit got some good numbers and probably some good benefits. And I was thinking about the operational unit at that time. But we did some leaps and bounds in that year because there was a lot of room, a lot of latitude to move in. So putting the strike aside, I think it was a, you know, it was a good agreement.
Was that CSEA's first job action under the Taylor Law?
Well, I'm not sure of the time frame. We did have a job action in Dutchess County where the people went out. We had a job action in Columbia County. We had various little stops here and there, but I don't know the time frame. Dutchess County was a biggie. They were out for a while and they paid some pretty serious consequences. But I think I can remember being down there for a week.
What was part of what was happening at that time testing out the law, seeing if the state would uphold the provisions of the law, and kind of like trying to learn the parameters?
Hold on.
Test the
Yeah,
law,
roll again.
or you want to ask the
Yeah,
question?
go right ahead.
Or what the purpose of what we were doing. I don't think we were so much testing the law, but the big test was, from my perspective, there was language in there that said you could strike if there was extreme provocation. And we definitely were testing that. And myself and a lot of the staff were constantly putting pressure on our superiors that there was extreme provocation. And I think that might have been litigated in that Triborough thing over the, you know, the tunnel shutdown and the fans in the tunnel. I'm not sure. But there was always extreme provocation, and in some of the cases, you might, if you went back in history and checked, there was, and maybe even in our case, there was some leniency because while PERB didn't agree there was extreme provocation, it was questionable. So we always paid the 2-for-1, but the penalty might have been of a lesser degree. And that was the big thing we were testing. And in checking with Jerry Lefkowitz in the past couple of years, tells me it's still in the law, but you never hear about it, and I guess it's not about to be challenged today. So, you know, that could have been it. But I don't think we were constantly there was constant questions being raised about what applies. The law, whether it be the Taylor law or civil service law. And that was really a frustrating thing for myself and a lot of my peers, because management would say, oh, that's in the law, that we can't negotiate, that's civil service law. Well, history will show you that many, many, many things that they said were non-negotiable today are just as a matter of fact being negotiated, with very few exceptions.
And I suppose in a lot of ways that's sort of almost a microcosm of how CSEA has evolved, in that much of what the union does today is about working at the negotiating table and also working through the political action process to address laws or circumstances that may be beyond the scope of the bargaining.
Right. And I think there's probably less focus, but I don't think there should be, on the civil service law. You know, the 1 out of 3 and those type of hearings. But at that point in time, they were dramatic. Today, while it's there, I don't think we emphasize it or get on it as much as we used to. It's more like you say.
There's a very well-known provision that's sort of an adjunct to the Taylor Law, and that's the Triborough Amendment. I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about the history of the Triborough Amendment and what it actually means.
Okay. Well, what happened early on, and I don't know the exact years, I came here in '68, but there was a strike down, the bridge and tunnel people that were covered, the Triborough Bridge Authority group, and the president was a guy named Tony Mario. They walked off the job because they claimed that they were being exposed to carbon monoxide, which had a effect on the workers, and that was due to the lack of maintenance on the fans and the clean air in the tunnels. So they went off on strike. And if you can imagine, people walk off the job on the tunnels in New York City, the chaos that it created. I mean, shut the state down. It was awful. It got national attention. So they went back to work, but one of the things that Governor Rockefeller agreed to was that he would put together a blue ribbon committee, whatever you call it, to study the impact of the lack of fresh air in the tunnels and whether there was any permanent effect from this carbon monoxide. To my great surprise and pleasure, I was appointed by Governor Rockefeller to that committee. We met periodically in New York City. Carl Matty, who was the Commissioner of Labor, was the chairman of the committee. Several doctors and other big name people were involved. Tony Morrow was the president of the tribal group. He was on the committee. And obviously I became his best friend. And we served on that committee. I don't know how long it took to make the study, but ultimately they came out with a document that, God, it was probably 2.5 to 3 inches thick, that basically said there's no permanent effects on being overexposed to carbon monoxide or words to that effect. So they just whitewash. In my mind, it was a whitewash. At that time, I was upset, but I wasn't knowledgeable enough to really to argue the issues, although I did raise some questions, and I was shot down rather quickly by the doctors. But what happened as a result of that strike, there was the tribal group was back to the table, and increments were being denied, and benefits were being denied because they had been bad, and they were being penalties implied, and so they litigated the actions of the employer, and PERB and the courts made certain determinations on what were permanent benefits and that could not be denied because of a job action. And one of the most critical one was the increment and whether the increments had to be carried forward. But there was a lot of other issues. And so you'll hear people talk about the tribal doctrine, and you can't do this because of the tribal doctrine, you can do this. It's all relative to the strike that took place down there in New York.
So, I mean, so what, how would you describe the Triborough Amendment in terms of what it does when you're at the negotiating table and coming up on a contract expiration?
Well, today, it's good because, you know, the precedent is set there and the employer knows that they have to continue certain benefits and therefore they just can't take everything away from us. And I'm not, I'd have to go do some reading to remember what's the good and bad about it though. So I think it's really been good for labor as I sit here today, going through the growing pains and not knowing and not having the decisions made and the appeals going on. It was something, it was kind of chaos. But I say today it has clarified a lot of issues. And one of the things, to digress again, when I was considering taking this job, I had a good friend of mine who was an attorney, wound up being a federal judge, said to me, Joe, this is a very good opportunity for you because it's a brand new law and you're going to watch this law develop and be able to be a part of the change. And he was so right. It was either that or sell insurance. So here's where I came, and I'm very, very happy about it. So there's a lot of changes out there, but I don't know them off the top of my head.
Tell me what you remember about Ted Wenzel.
What do I remember about Ted Wenzel? Ted Wenzel, on a personal note, went out with my aunt. I found out after I came to work here. So sometimes it was a little embarrassing to me at meetings. But he was, I would have to say, somewhat eccentric. He was different. He was an educator. I believe he was misplaced. But for me, as a person, he was supportive. Although I can tell you, once again, I was involved in the thruway the thruway unit representation stuff, and we had 2 units we were challenging out there, and we won one unit real big, and we lost the other unit. And Wenzel's gut reaction was to get Reedy out of there. So while I say I had a good rapport with him, he chose to pull me, but he didn't, because Joe Lochner, God bless his soul, just said, "Look, go ahead, just don't tell him you're out there, and go ahead and do what you've been doing." And we did, and we won. But he was. There's some very, very classic personal stories you could tell about him, but he was misplaced. But he was an intelligent individual, and because of that, he wasn't really bullied around by the attorneys. I mean, they you know, he was their equal, you know, on his feet when it came to intelligence. Was he their equal when it came to the law, as it relates to the labor law and the Taylor law? No, but he didn't. He was bullheaded and he didn't back off. But he was really misplaced. What was he was the doctor of education, you know.
So by means of transition, then, tell me about Bill McGowan and how he became president of CSEA.
Well, but Bill McGowan was the chairman of my operational negotiating committee. I don't know, the first or second time that we did the negotiations, I'm not sure. And he was a blue collar electrician technician out of West Seneca, up in Erie County. Entirely different. D's, do's, and dems, the cigar in the mouth, rough, understood the law, understood the people, was very close to the people, and then entirely, I mean, it was as different as day and night. He was just, from the union's perspective and the membership in that, and even, believe me, I had some major differences with Bill McGowan, but he was a diamond in the rough. He got in on a very small vote. I think there was a recount. It was always questionable about, how it came about. I wasn't there. I don't know. But Bill came on, and a lot of things changed. And we became more actually, we were recognized by our peers more as a labor organization. And Bill was people, and he wasn't aloof, and he was good at the job. So he was the right person at the right time. And yeah, a lot different than Ted Wenzel. But for those three units that we continue to represent, Bill was, just a real diamond in the rough, and brought the organization to some high levels. Now, having said that, he did get a lot of support from his staff and his attorneys around him. So Bill was willing to listen. And even with Wenzel, there was an entirely different attitude about staff. We were asked, and we met, and we gave input, and we actually made decisions on what cases should be appealed and how we felt about it, and what was going on out in the field. And Bill became more of that type of person when it came to the staff, and he was closely aligned with the staff. And he had more problems at the end. The board drove him. I was there. It was very difficult, but we had some good years under Bill.
Tell me about kind of two sides of the same coin. In 1978, losing the PS&T unit, and then the affiliation with AFSCME.
This is an area that I'm not that familiar with. What happened about in '78 was, I know I had been in the operational unit for 10 years, and I chose to leave, and there was an opening for collective bargaining specialists in local government. So I bid out. So I still, and I'm not even sure whether I was in the operational unit at that time, because it was 10-year period. And I was out in the local government. I was not here at headquarters at the time this came down. I was involved in the election to some degree, but as I mentioned to you earlier, staff was kind of removed from this challenge. But then Bill, and having not been privy to any of this, only through hearsay, Bill and Jim Romer, who was chief counsel at the time, went to Washington or wherever and met with Jerry McEntee and Jerry Worf and those people, and worked out an agreement for an affiliation. And then there was a meeting held out at the Italian Club, I believe, on Washington Avenue, and everybody was locked in. The board was called in, and staff were assigned to doors, and people weren't allowed to go out, and if they went out, somebody had to go with them to the bathroom to make this announcement that this affiliation had taken place. I had mixed emotions about it, and there's nothing I could say or do that would have changed it. I guess I wish we had affiliated sooner, but I'd have to say I was one of the people that probably didn't want to affiliate because I thought we could do it without them and do it better. but we didn't have the manpower, we didn't have the money, we just couldn't continue this battle forever. They were just draining us.
You say they were draining us, there were raids by AFL-CIO
Right.
unions on different CSEA units.
Right, and AFL-CIO nationally were putting money into this, so they had a bottomless pit, and we didn't. And we did a great job while we were in the fight. So, you know, I wish, like everybody else, that we had been able to cut a better deal, but we didn't, and I think it was the right move at the right time. I would never, ever be one to say that it was good that we lost the PS&T unit. I mean, one of the major things I might have disagreed with Bill on, because Bill did say that once in a while, I'm just glad we got rid of them, but they were a source of irritation to Bill. But I mean, 35,000 members is not, it's not a good loss, but it happened. And the affiliation was the right move. And I suppose there was pressure in those rooms. And I know my good friend Deb Stack has got a few gray hairs over what it cost us to continue to be affiliated. But, you know, I wouldn't have wanted to change places with those people that had to put it together at that time. So I have no qualms or any second guessing of what happened at the time. But it was historic. But we survived, you know, and we're here.
Do you remember, were there two challenges? Was there like one challenge from the PS&T unit that was fought back and then they came back again a year later?
I'm not sure of that, but if you told me that was true, I would probably agree with you, because it appears that I was not out there with the operational unit, and that PS&T was in a challenge period, and they were doing it on their own. And I think at that time a guy named Paul Birch was heading up the PS&T unit. So if you tell me that's what happened, I would have to agree.
You talked a little bit about having mixed emotions about the affiliation. Was there a difficulty for staff especially, or even within the organization, of kind of making that transition to become a part of this AFL-CIO when in fact they had been raiding us for all these years?
Oh yeah, yeah, and breaking bread with some of these people. I mean, the Champas and those people that we ran into out in the street, and to this day, I mean, I always felt as if we were a little bit above them when it came to the service of our people and what service we provided and what representation we provided for the membership. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we had we had some barroom brawls. We had some pretty heated discussions with these people. We had some one-on-one confrontations. So it was tough for the staff, but we kind of kept away from them, you know. It was a gradual transition, and except for the hierarchy, we didn't get them shoved down our throat, so to speak. And I think that ASME knew better than to really force their will upon us. And I never felt really that they were infringing upon what I was doing in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But I only speak for myself. I'm sure there's other people that felt differently. But and you're right, there was people that resented it and were angry about it, and there were board members. Don't forget, we lost our PS&T unit. We lost all those people on the board, with a couple exceptions, and you know who they are. So yeah, I wasn't impacted like a lot of the people here. At that time, I had pretty much gone out into local government and was doing contracts out there. So it wasn't, that transition wasn't as hard for me as some other people.
We'll come back to that in a second about the local government side, but you know, you talked earlier about constant change, and here you had McGowan, who's just a very different kind of leader in the organization. The affiliation with ASME, was that where CSEA really turned the corner and became much more of a labor organization as opposed to a professional association?
Well, obviously they had to. They didn't have any choice. So yeah, that was, you know, we were a part of the nationwide. We were a part of the brotherhood, or whatever you want to call it. So just by the fact that we did affiliate, we became more identified and more familiar with the labor organization, but I have to tell you, as I sit here today, we have a lot of membership that don't understand that, and maybe even some of the staff people. But in theory and in concept and the change, it was dramatic, yes. And it had a lot of benefits to it, too. It had a lot of benefits to it. You know, I digress once again for a moment. When we did we put together our very first contracts, the booklet, the question came up about a union bug being on that contract. And we had to have a union bug. And our communications people designed this little small bug that they called a union bug and put it on the contract. It was not a union bug any more than whatever. But they created this little thing like a union bug. And I don't know, I'm sure it's changed, but at the time, Joe Ruler and maybe even Marv Naylor, but they sat down and created this little thing that went on the contracts, and they called it a union bug. We weren't going to send out our contracts to have some union shop do it and admit that we weren't union. So, yet we weren't affiliated. So that type of thing was going.
Let me come back to the issue of local government. You said in that time frame in the late 70s you were doing some work on the local government side. What was the scenario out in local government for CSEA at that time?
Well, let me tell you, not go there for the moment. Let me tell you, when I first came here, I was doing local government. Local government, we had gotten voluntary recognition. A lot of the employers were glad to grab CSEA because we were non-union, wherever we were, and they were willing to come to the table with us and cut a deal and make a contract. And my responsibility was putting together contract language, and ultimately I went out and did negotiations. The first contract I did was in Jefferson County, and that was early on in the late 60s or 70s. And I have to tell you this because I'm going to try to give you the difference in that in 10 years later. But it was easy at the table in them times, except up in Jefferson County, they brought in a professional to come in from the community college there, and they had a professional up from the county. And they came in with a study plan on salaries called the Smith Plan. And what it was doing was it was going to bump up all the management people. Some of the management people, the guy across the table from me, Clark Hamill, I remember his name, had one arm, he was going to get like a 30% boost. And some of the people in the labor department weren't even going to get any money. So after a whole lot of negotiations and heated negotiations, we wound up with a 6% across the board. And we got a ratification on that contract, an overwhelming ratification. And the next morning I headed back to Albany, and I called in to make sure that everything was okay and tell them about my successful negotiations. And I was told I'd better turn around and go back to Jefferson County because the Clark Hamlin had told the membership that we had sold them out, and that went to these people that were going to get these big raises and told them that we had undermined them, sold them out, and they were calling for my head. And it was on the radios and was on everything. And it was a nightmare. And ultimately I went back up and I accused them of bad faith, and the guy from the community college agreed with me, and I got apologies, and I had some problems, but everything worked out in the long run. 10 years later, well, no. At the same period of time, I was sent to do a more difficult merger of school districts up in Essex County. 2 school districts merged, and they had dramatically different benefits. And they assigned this, he looked like Gadabout Gaddis, was an old school administrator, to do the contract with me. And I had committees from both school districts with different benefits. Long story short, they gave me the latitude to meet with this guy. And we would sit down and just meet and discuss. You got to do this with the sick leave. There was big differences: sick leave, holidays, vacation. And I'd go into him and say to him, "Look, at these people are only getting a couple $100 raise. Can you bump them up another $300? Can you do this? Can you do that?" In some cases, he agreed with me. But ultimately, we were able to work this out in the basement of these school districts. Go back and get some, get the contract ratified. There was a lot of other issues there, you know. My president got kicked off the team because he had knocked some student on his ass getting off the bus. But anyway, it went well. Those were the old days. 10 years later, now I'm doing local government. We've got lawyers out there. We've got people at the table that are more sophisticated. We've got contracts in place. And where you had maybe weak administrators, you've been able to get some real good benefits. And now you get some people coming in and saying, you know, they got too much. They're getting too much. Retirement became an issue. The big thing was retention. It was a whole different ballgame 10 years later, because now local government had realized that, you know, they had some authority. We used to tell them a lot of things, and they just buy it. They didn't have these attorneys. So it became a lot more sophisticated. I worked out of Albany, and what would happen was if the more difficult contracts, the staff would say, or if the staff had problems previously, they would ask for some help out of Albany, and myself and 3 or 4 other staff would be assigned to those contracts. Or McGowan would, and don't ever put this anyplace but here, but McGowan would say to somebody, oh, I got this guy up in Albany, Joe Reedy, he's great, I'll send him down to do your contract. So you get down there to do the contract, and the president would be so happy you got this guy from Albany. You know, I was no better than probably the negotiator they had there, but that was a resource he had, and he used it. So, but they were the more difficult negotiations. I had a lot of latitude. I didn't have the lawyers here in Albany and people making second guessing what I did. I did what I wanted to do. I was in charge of my own destiny. I was able to create my relationship both with the employer and with the staff, and I was much happier. That's why I left and went into local government, because I was getting, there was more control and more involvement by the legal side of the aisle, and so, you know, you would say something and then you'd have to renege your, you know, you couldn't live up to your commitment because somebody would say, you know, you shouldn't have said that. So that became my frustration, and I saw some things I didn't like. So I went out to local government. It was work-wise, it was a great period of time for me. Well, a lot of self-satisfaction, a lot of rewards. 2 or 3 times around, it became a little bit more enduring because you run into the same people with the same scenario and all of that. Downstate, closer to the city, became more difficult because they wanted the money that everybody in New York State was making. Upstate was somewhat easier, and I did very little negotiations in the capital region with Jack Corcoran and that. But I did a lot in Region 3 and some in 4 and well, 5 and 6. And very little on the island. But we were busy, so it was different because, you know, it's like it is today. I mean, you have to be creative to come up with other things other than health insurance, leave time, and salary. So, but there was that great 10 years that we did a lot of great things. And I had one of my peers say to me, you know, Joe, I don't try to get, I walk away from that table with whatever makes my team happy because I know I have to come back next time. So there was 2 different concepts out there too. But I think, you know, we've reached a saturation point. They loved us. They liked the fact that they had a union to speak up for them. But 10 years later, and today, it's a whole lot different, you know.
Do you remember much about the fight to get the PESH Act enacted, the Safety and Health Act?
No, I actually hadn't. Because I had the blue collar workers, you know, I had a lot of problems with safety stuff. But we were always able to, I think, resolve them, whether it be through the grievance procedure or what. So I had very little involvement with PESH. Actually, none.
Okay. Let me jump forward about 20 years. What do you remember about the big fight over the state contract in 99 and 2000 when the membership voted the contract down, and there was kind of a statewide campaign for about a year to try to put pressure on the state?
That was a very difficult time for me. You know, That's a tough one for me to talk about. Uh, uh, it was difficult. It was a very difficult time. And I think, though, we were very, very fortunate in the way we were able to take a year and turn this thing around. Uh, it was probably one of the more difficult times for me working for CSEA. We had always set the pattern in the state, you know, and now I do a little Joe Reedy stuff. But when I went into Bill McGowan's office, Bill pulled me back. I was out in the field at that time to do the Office of Court Administration contract. Bob Guile had gotten sick, and I didn't want to come back. As a matter of fact, I filed a grievance against Bill McGowan, and I was sitting in Bill McGowan's office looking at arbitration against Bill McGowan with the FSA because I was on a leave of absence from the job. But what had happened the previous time frame was, and it was the first time frame that we had ever allowed another organization to settle before us, and it was the state police. We allowed that. That's my opinion. With the numbers we had and the clout we had over there, it shouldn't have happened. So when I got into Bill's office, I said, Bill, you know, we can't let them settle again ahead of us. And my 2 years in Bill's office was working with Nancy Hose. He brought in Ernie Revelinski from ASME, and I became very close to him. But my responsibility at that point, and I'd say with the greatest humility, I put that thing together in these little sessions with Nancy Hose and Jerry Dudak and that. And it was a terrible experience for me because I go to Nancy and I'd say, we need this, and she'd say this, that, and I go back to Bill and Ernie and I'd say, we can't get that, and she'd go back and tell the fucking blah, blah. And I was constantly getting beat up. So I had a real involvement in that process. So when this thing came down, maybe I knew too much, you know, or maybe I think I know too much. But I was unhappy with that, and you know, Danny and I had not a major issue about it, but I had a suggestion I made to him that, you know, caused him to go a little off on me. So that was, but in the end, I think that we were very, very fortunate. I think you and I think everybody here did a great job of turning that around. So in retrospect, I said, you know, we caught up, we did good, and I guess no harm was done, except the aggravation of myself and a few others, you know, and probably you too, at least from from whatever you had to do. Yeah. So yeah, it was a bad day, bad time in our history.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about some of the other memorable characters you remember from CSEA.
Jesus.
You mentioned, like, for example, you mentioned Joe Dolan earlier. And certainly
You know, there was, you wouldn't, this has nothing to do with the labor movement. Henry Galpin was Joe Lochner's assistant director, and he was a very, very brilliant guy, but had no place. He was probably equal to Ted Wenzel. He was smarter than you could believe, and it has nothing to do with any of this, but we're at the convention down at the Concord, and he's out on the ice skating arena with a scarf around his neck skating, and Joe Lochner, who I truly had awful problems with, he made this organization. Without Joe Lochner, would be no CSEA today. And he was a tyrant, and he was tough. But he was also a good friend. And he went crazy with Henry. He was always screaming. And you would constantly hear Joe Lochner and Jack Rice fighting and arguing in the hallway. I mean, Joe was just a tough-headed Dutchman. And Ruth Bailey, I guess, was his secretary. And then there was Mary Blair, who actually interviewed me and hired me for the job, who I, to this day, respect and love. Was very, very intelligent, and she was our expert on the retirement law. And then we had a series of executive directors, Dolan being one. Bernie, the shoe, whoever, you've heard him talk about Bernie, I don't know what the shoe was. You had Larry Scanlon. Larry Scanlon was a staff person that worked his way up and was deserving of the position. The shoe came out of nowhere. It was hard to come into this organization with that type of with no support, so to speak. We had the board of directors. We had Saul Bendet, who was Saul Bendet. They used to say Saul Bendet will die when he decides it's time to die. And my friends, I didn't get involved with Saul Bendet, but he was a tyrant. There was a guy, Afro-American, Randy Jacobs, on the board. He was tough. Probably another character that I just truly loved and thought the world of and had a good relationship was Irving Flamingbaum from Long Island. And he and I got along well. I didn't go out with him or socialize with him, but we had a mutual respect for each other. Tom McDonough, who was the vice president and always looking to become the president, and I got along well throughout the years, and he was a character, constantly running for office. Joe McDermott and I got along relatively well, but I had problems with his support of the law firm when I was in Bill's office and that. Who else was there for characters? There was a guy named Jimmy Lennon, who was the regional director, or not the regional president down in 3, who was a character. He worked for the Bridge, for the Bridge, for the.
I think so, yeah. Bridge Authority.
I think the Bridge Authority. Court Pat Masholi. I politically got involved in a couple of his campaigns, but I was outside at that time. Jimmy Moore, who's still here. Another real wonderful, wonderful person I met, who has since passed away, was a guy named Johnny Clark. Came from Letchworth Village. He was chairman of my negotiating committee after Bill ascended to the presidency. Just a great guy. Was captured in the Battle of the Bulge, was a prisoner of war for 9 months. I kept in touch with his wife long after he passed away. He died of throat cancer. I thought and still think I had a lot of, he'd be surprised to hear me say this, but I really had a lot of admiration for Latimer and respect for Latimer. Latimer was a people person. He and I had dynamic differences about the law firm, along with Al Mead. And to this day, I consider myself somewhat of a friend of Al Mead's. You had Nels Carlson, who was a collective bargaining specialist, which had a good relationship with McGowan. I actually put a lot of thoughts into McGowan's cap prior to the negotiations that I was involved with. We went away on a think camp up at Canoe Island, and Nels was there with myself and Bill and a couple other people putting together our plans for the negotiations. Conaby was the administrator, the staff involved in the administrative unit. Was always considered aloof, not too well liked by his peers, I would say. I don't know. He's kind of a friend of mine. But there was a lot of characters out there, Dave Stack just brought to my attention Dr. Bernard, I can't think of his last name, from New York, just passed away. He was on our board of directors. He was a surgeon, quite a physician. And we had some real characters on that board. We had, without a doubt, Jack Rice will always be held on in a special plateau for myself. I continue to be friends with Fred Reister, who was with the law firm and assigned to me on most of my responsibilities. Featherstone Ha, who was a character, had me in his home that supposed to be a haunted house. He was very, very close to staff. Marty Langer, haven't seen in a few years. I guess I could go on and on and on, but and I can remember back those years probably sometimes a lot better than yesterday. But they were good years. They were trying, but you think about it now, and it's. Although I have to tell you, Steve, it hasn't changed that much. Coming back after being gone for 6 years, the members are still the members. we're constantly trying to do creative things, but I noticed even in going through my old files, some of the creative things we are doing today were concepts that we had years ago. I shared this with Jerry a couple of years ago, but in my old files of a copy of The Leader, there's a copy, a big headline, CSEA demands that Jerry Lefkowitz be fired. And then there was Marge Carreau, who was chief counsel, when the law firm was dismissed or let go. So, yeah, I guess if I had the education and the ability, myself, I think I could write some pretty good stuff,
Sure.
coming from the private sector today and the characters. And there's a big difference with the staff. Because I love the staff. I thought I had great staff up in Region 4, and I would never change it for the world. But they're different. They're different than they were years ago. There was, I think, more of a commitment to the job. We did everything. I organized. I did it all. I went wherever I had to do, did whatever I had. There was never a question asked. And there was not by anybody else. You were out there and doing organizing or whatever it called on to do it. And we had our good times. So.
I realized I didn't ask you about the Palace Theater. What happened at the Palace Theater in 1975?
CSEA decided that they were going to have a strike. I'm not sure what motivated the strike, but we were going to have this big strike. And we were going to have this meeting at the Palace Theater. And it was set up that Marty Langer was going to make the motion to strike, and they had somebody lined up to do the second. And it was all done kind of sporadically. I don't even know what we were mad about at the time. Probably inability to get a contract or a strike for the sake of a strike.
You carry cutbacks and what have you.
Something like that. And so, but Saul Ben Dead and some of his people got wind of it, and they didn't want any part of any strike. And they had a board meeting. Did they have a board meeting the day of the strike? A call. I think they might have had an emergency board meeting, but we were assigned to the Palace Theater, and all the delegates were coming in, and it was a fiasco. And before Marty could even get to the microphone, there was all kinds of chaos. And I think Marty did get up to make his motion to strike, and he just got kind of blown out of proportion. And the membership, or the delegates, went after Wenzel, who was on stage, and he became so scared. I remember he says to us, and I was always there, follow me out to the car, So we had to hush him out to a car, literally, and shove him into a car, and people were reaching to grab him, and we took him to a Holiday Inn here in Latham and hit him. And then I don't even know how we bailed out of that one, but that was that was not a good moment in our history. And I have to say, it could have got physical, because it was like, it might have been midday, and our people, if they came in the night before, especially my people, would have a tendency to have a drink or two. So I'm not going to say they were liquored up or anything like that, but they were ready to bear. And Wenzel was not the type of a labor leader, and he couldn't handle it. He just panicked. It just went crazy. So getting him out of there probably saved the whole. And I don't know what happened at the Palace after that, because our responsibility was to get him where we had to get him. And oh boy, this is good. That was funny. Yeah.
Let me let you get a drink there, and
Yeah.
I ask you one final question.
Did
We got
you
tape.
hand with that? Yeah, you got it.
I got it?
I think you did.
Why do you think CSEA has been able to be around for 100 years?
I think because they do a good job. I think they do a good job. I think that they have a good relationship with the membership. They understand the state, and recently they know how to lobby. They always knew how to lobby. I think Bryce was a good friend with Warren Bridges from Buffalo at the time. So I just think that we have, it's not a perfect world, but I think we know the membership, and we know them a lot better. And proof is in there. We know them better than PST knows the membership, because I think the group that we have and the people that we represent are, in my mind, kind of the grassroots people. Now, forget it, out there in the field in local government, we have a lot of high management people. But I just think that we've always done a class job, and you know, do I wish it were better? Sure, but I think that we're head and shoulders above our competitors out there, and our competitors, my experience, are removed from the membership. You know, and a lot of our people come up through the ranks and file. You know, my association with the Teamsters was very, very good, and when I had my strike, those people were very good to me. But by the same token, they were not a democracy like we are. And you know, God bless us all, I mentioned him, Johnny Clark used to say, what we should be is a benevolent dictatorship. And we might be a little bit closer to that than we were years ago, because we have taken some of the control, a lot more of the control than we had back, and then where the board would go to bed one night and get up the next day and tell you got to change things. So I just think we do a good job. I think we're a class organization. I'm proud to have been a part of it. With very few exceptions, I just think we're. No, I wish these guys out there, these ladies and them, that we hired today, probably had a better understanding. You know, I think some of them think it's a job and it's a well-paying job. But then again, you know, they look at you and say, you know, let go, you old man. You know, it's time to let go. It's not what it was, and so on and so forth. So I think we do a class job, and that's why I think we survive.
Wonderful.
Now I have are we done? Because I
Sure.
have a thought that I want to lay on you.
Okay,
and
go right ahead.
Do you want me to
Yeah.
stop tape, or are we rolling?
Maybe roll out of this
Okay,
for a little
good,
bit and see
sure.
what you want to do with it. We've had this problem with organizing, okay? I don't have any answers to organizing, but I do know in my heart that the unions nationwide have been unable to organize white-collar workers, computer workers, and those type of people. They don't seem to want unions. I live up in the Saratoga area. They've been talking about 10,000 workers coming up there to the Luther Forest area that are going to be associated with these disk chip factories, I guess. And the projection is 10,000 employees. And they're talking about getting water from the Hudson and all of that. I think, I'll have this conversation with Dan if I ever do, we as an organization ought to start looking at that group, whoever they be. They're going to be high-paid people. They're not going to be low-paid people. Somebody ought to start looking at that group, what they're going to encompass, who they're going to be, where they're going to come, how. Maybe, you know, I hear this word SALT from organizing, but maybe we should be starting to look at where these people are in the universe and be ahead of the game. And when they start moving these people in out there, we could start organizing them as opposed to going in after the fact. Chip plants they are. But I know my wife keeps telling me there are going to be high-paid white-collar workers, and they're talking 10,000.
Right.
And I have no concept other than the basic understanding of organizing, but there's a group we should be looking at, and we should be looking at now, not 5 years from now, because they're not going to be there for 3 or 4 years, you know? Maybe the unions or research or somebody can find out what type of people commonly work in these jobs. I don't know, but that's a number that we should be looking at, you know? So that's just a thought.